So this is a timeline that covers the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. We're going to go from 1889, when they founded Johns Hopkins Hospital. Okay, here we go. So we start in 1889 with Johns Hopkins Hospital. This is an image of opening day from Johns Hopkins itself. In 1912, so jump forward a few years. Sorry, guys. In 1912, Alexis Carrel falsely claims to have successfully grown immortal chicken heart cells. So hopefully that's a part of the book that sticks out. And remember that I've been calling Rebecca Skloot's narrative, the way she handles and presents this story to you, is what I would consider to be non-linear. So it's not going from point A to point B, it's going kind of back and forth through time. So if you will recall, they speak about Alexis Carrel's claims to have created these immortal chicken heart cells fairly early on in the novel. Sorry, not a novel. My bad. This book is not a novel. Novels are fictitious. This is nonfiction, so my apologies. In any case, early in the book, this is mentioned. So let's go to 1920. This is the slide in which that represents Henrietta's birth, basically. In 1920, Henrietta Lacks is born in Roanoke, Virginia. The image on the left is the home house, which is where Henrietta and Day grew up. It's little more than a tin roof and some thin oak boards, thin pine boards perhaps. And then a contrasting image of downtown Roanoke, also from the 20s. So I thought those were kind of interesting. Now let's jump another 20 years, 27 years, and we're coming out of World War II, okay? So all the atrocities, all of the war and the conflict, after that's all over, in 1946, of December in 1946, an American military tribunal opened criminal proceedings against 23 leading German physicians and administrators for their willing participation in war crimes and other crimes against humanity. Among other requirements, the Nuremberg Code, which is the document that they created from these Nuremberg trials, the Nuremberg Code sets forth the requirements of voluntary informed consent of the human subject. So people that had been experimented on by Nazi doctors did not have the opportunity to provide informed consent, obviously, and this was deemed a war crime, and had a drastic effect on all legislation about informed consent going forward. So it's an important point in time to remember and to think about, kind of in the greater context of what's happening with Henrietta Lacks, what's happening with medicine, what's happening in United States politics, what's happening in world politics at this time. Okay, so let's pop up again a few more years, just a handful of years this time, which brings us to 1951. And while this slide is loading, I'll tell you quickly that this is the year, if you remember, hopefully you remember, that not only does George Gay successfully culture the first immortal human cell lines using cells from Henrietta's cervix. He first gives the name to the sample of Gila, if you'll remember from the book. I hope you remember. That's a pretty prominent point. Sorry, the slide's not loading. I'm just going to continue to tell you a little bit more about it. Also in 1951, this is when Henrietta Lacks actually dies of the cervical cancer. And then in 1952, still on the same slide, the Gila cells are the first living cells that are shipped via postal mail. So 1952 continued, which is this next slide, is when the Tuskegee Institute, who later goes on to do some other memorable things in American medicine, um, including experimentation on African American men with syphilis. Um, the Tuskegee Institute opens the first HeLa quote unquote factory, where they supply cells to laboratories and researchers, and they operate also as a nonprofit. But in a few years, or within the next few years, another company came about and began to sell HeLa for a profit. They were called Microbiological Associates, and that was in 1952. Still in 1952, this is when Jonas Salk's vaccine for polio became available, and started being given to children, given to people as a vaccination. Scientists were able to use the HeLa cell line to help develop the polio vaccine. And thinking about that is really interesting, because not only did they use it for the polio vaccine, they've used it for countless other reasons, including in vitro fertilization, other vaccinations, including COVID-19. They did use HeLa cells. Some of the companies developing vaccines were able to use HeLa cells to perform tests on and to develop these vaccines. So that's an image of Jonas Salk here, and this is the actual polio vaccine as it looked initially. Now, initially for the polio vaccine, and I just learned this the other day from my dad, because he was alive back then, but the first couple of years of the polio vaccine they gave via injection, until they were able to stabilize it enough that the kids, like my dad, were able to get their polio vaccine on a sugar cube. And then they got in line, got their sugar cube, were vaccinated at school. Everybody was vaccinated, and it saved countless lives. Okay, so let's bump up a couple of years, 1954. In 1954, the pseudonym Helen Lane first appears in print as the source of the HeLa cells. So you'll remember that from the book. That was a pretty giant disservice to and a mystery for a while for a lot of scientists, but a disservice to the woman whose cells these were from in the first place. And then in 1954, also, we see another doctor by title that begins to conduct experiments without patient consent to see whether or not the injections of HeLa cells themselves could cause cancer in the subject. We do come back and kind of learn more about him, about Southam, here in a little while. The images here are dyed slides of actual HeLa cells, and I just thought that they were rather beautiful. The one to the left really reminds me of a peacock feathers, so that was kind of neat. 1957 is the first time the term informed consent first appears in court documents. 1957, the term informed consent first appeared in court documents in 1957 in a civil court ruling on the case of a patient named Martin Salgo. He went under anesthesia for what he thought was a routine procedure and woke up permanently paralyzed from the waist down. The doctor hadn't told him the procedure carried any risks at all. I don't know why there's a "the" there at the end, my bad. Poor editing on my part. This is actually a quote directly from TILHL, and it just goes to show 1957, only 6 years after Henrietta Lacks had died, we're seeing the term informed consent appear in court documents. So remember, we've seen it in the Nuremberg Code back in the Nuremberg trials around 46, 47, and now we're finally seeing it in some of the United States legal system documents. So it's kind of becoming more of a thing, but it's taking some time to gain traction. 1965, I don't have a slide for this. Maybe I should have made one, but well, I have a slide for 1965, but what I wanted to mention, this is not on the slide, was that HeLa cells in 1965 are fused for the first time with another animal's cells. They're fused with mouse cells, which creates the first animal-human hybrid cells, which I don't have any more information on. It was just something that I thought was really interesting when I found it and when I was putting the timeline together. So if you're interested in learning more, please tell me what you find out. I'd be interested too. Okay, so I said we'd hear more about this Dr. Southam again. So 1965 is when, so in 1954 is when Chester Southam began conducting his experiments, trying to see if the HeLa cells, if injected, could cause cancer. So in 65, finally, the Board of Regents of the University of the State of New York finds Southam and a colleague of his guilty of unprofessional conduct and calls for stricter guidelines regarding human research subjects and informed consent. Now this one directly leads to, in 1966, to ensure the adherence to these new guidelines for research involving human subjects, the National Institute of Health begins requiring the approval of institutional review boards for any research that they fund. So if any of you guys have done any research, maybe through URSA, the Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Activities Office at UAF, or perhaps have worked with any of your professors doing any research, or maybe even done any research on your own, you will probably have heard of institutional review boards that are kind of an oversight for any research done involving human subjects. So even if you're doing a survey of students on campus, but you want to eventually publish this information, you're going to need to be certified and overviewed by the institutional review board. So that's kind of where this came about and how that board itself was formed. 1971. Actually, I wanted to mention in 1966, I should have made a slide for this. I don't know what happened here, but Gartler, if you remember, I think they talk about this in the book, drops what they called the HeLa bomb, and that's when he proposed that HeLa cells had contaminated numerous cell lines, not only in America but throughout the world. And so this started a search for whether or not HeLa cells were indeed had indeed contaminated other cell lines, and if there were other cell lines that were viable and whole. 1970, we're still not quite to this slide, but there is no slide for this as well. George Gay finally, he dies too. He dies himself of pancreatic cancer. Here we are, 1971. So Henrietta Lacks is correctly identified for the first time in print as the source of HeLa. And they do this in a tribute, of course, to George Gay, which is an interesting commentary on how much they valued Henrietta Lacks's contribution at this point. And then the image here is actually the record of, it's a death certificate for Henrietta Lacks from 1951, October 4th. It's kind of interesting. It's a pretty excellent reprint too. So if you want to go and check this out on your own, please do so. Okay, so 1973, only a couple of years later, the Lacks family learns for the first time that Henrietta's cells are still alive. Researchers from Johns Hopkins take samples from Henrietta's children to further HeLa research without informed consent. So even though we've been seeing this since the late 40s, informed consent, the idea of informed consent, the idea that, hey, wait, those are my tissues, those came from my body, like, why are you doing things with them for which I never gave consent? So There's an image here, of course, and this is, I think, also in the book. It's in my copy, and this is a picture of a lot of the surviving Lax family. 1974. This is the year that finally we see some federal policy for the protection of human subjects. This is also called the Common Rule. The Common Rule requires informed consent for all human subject research. Federal policy for the protection of human subjects is its other name. Now, originally this was issued in 1974 as a part of the Code of Federal Regulations by TILHL, and in 1991, so we're talking almost 20 years later, it's finally adopted and accepted by 15 agencies. At the time I created this timeline, there are currently 17 federal agencies to which the Common Rule applies. And the FDA, notably, is not one of them. And the FDA is the Federal Drug Administration. And they are also in charge of approving medications. 1975, this is the year that Michael Rogers publishes his article called "The Double-Edged Helix" in Rolling Stone magazine. So you'll see Rolling Stone, the cover, where double-edged helix is featured. And then this is also the year that the Lax family learns for the first time that Henrietta's cells have been commercialized. So it's 1975, they're finally, they know her cell line is immortal. They've been tested themselves by doctors at Johns Hopkins without informed consent, and now they're finding out that they who cannot afford their own health insurance, their mother, their aunt, their sister, her cells are being commercialized and produced throughout the world for others' profit. I imagine that was a difficult year. Now, 1984 to 1991 sees a case from a fellow called John Moore. He was a cancer patient, and he unsuccessfully, initially in 1884, sues his doctor and the Board of Regents of the University of California for property rights over his tissues. And he loses and he appeals. So in that 1988 appeal in the California Court of Appeals, they rule in Moore's favor, saying that patients must have the power to control what becomes of their own tissues. And Moore's doctor and the University of California appeal. So they're going to go back and forth over this. And it finally went up to the Supreme Court of California in 1991, who ruled against John Moore, saying that once tissues are removed from the body with or without consent, a person no longer owns those tissues. So this is still in the early 90s, late 80s, this question of consent, this question of ownership, who owns these tissues, even though they came from your body. This is all being litigated. This is all being processed through our law system to try and figure out where we stand on informed consent and tissue ownership. So it's a hot topic for decades, essentially. Brings us to 1996. This is when HIPAA first came about. So HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and it happened in 1996. So pretty recently, to my mind. I realize maybe not all of you were born yet, but I was. I was 15. Yeah, do your math, figure it out. JK. But anyway, so this HIPAA Act makes it illegal for healthcare providers or health insurers, so health insurance, to make personal medical information public. They cannot tell your employer that you have um, tuberculosis. They cannot tell your, um, you know, your mortgage lender that you have cancer. They can't tell anybody anything about you personally. Nobody can share without your direct written consent. A big move forward as far as consent goes. And then hop forward another 3 years, and in 1999, just as a kind of point of interest, the RAND Corporation produces this study. It's called Research Involving Human Biological Materials, Ethical Issues, and Policy Guidance. And in this study, they stipulate that there are over 307 million samples. So we're talking tissue samples when I say samples here. So they published a report that with a conservative estimate, more than 300 million tissue samples from more than 178 million people are stored in the United States alone. So this is only the United States. This is no other country included in this study. So that's nearly 2/3 of the American population have some sort of tissue that is somewhere being stored for potentially using in a study. And then also that this sample, this database, this collection of samples is growing at a rate of about 20 million per year. So I don't know. I found that very interesting. I found that slightly disconcerting, but now we all know. So let's hop forward in time 6 more years, 2005. By this time, there have been some other challenges to legal challenges to debate whose tissue samples are whose. For example, in 2005, members of the Native American Havasupai tribe sue Arizona State after scientists take tissue samples from the tribe donated for diabetes research and use them without consent instead to study schizophrenia and inbreeding. The Havasupai tribe won, and then also 6,000 patients join a lawsuit against Washington University, demanding that the university remove their tissue samples from the prostate cancer bank, their prostate cancer bank. And so one court ruled against the patients and they appealed, and the second court also ruled against the patients, saying that the Washington University did not have to remove their tissue samples. And then, so this slide is showing that in 2005, by this year, the U.S. government, this is another, this took me aback. The U.S. government has issued patents relating to the use of about 20% of known human genes, including genes for Alzheimer's, asthma, colon cancer, and most famously breast cancer. So this actually became a problem, and in 2006, an NIH researcher, so that's a researcher employed at the National Institute of Health, is charged with violating a federal conflict of interest law for providing thousands of tissue samples to the pharmaceutical company Pfizer in exchange for about $500,000. I really liked this illustration. I thought it showed a good visual representation of conflict of interest, where this particular researcher is employed and getting paid by this company, but seeks to make profit by perhaps taking information from this company and selling it elsewhere. So it shows kind of the person stuck in the middle between these two options. And then in 2009, we were talking a little bit about patenting human genes, including Alzheimer's, asthma, colon cancer, breast cancer, etc. So in 2009, more than 150,000 scientists joined the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and breast cancer patients in suing Myriad Genetics over its breast cancer gene patents. The suit claims that the practice of gene patenting violates the patent law and has inhibited scientific research. So the images here are of an actual protester of the Myriad genetics in 2009, and then another campaign of fight to take back our genetics and getting challenging patents on cancer genes and challenging ownership of tissues in favor of patients' rights. And that 2009 is the year right before Rebecca Skloot actually published The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks in 2010. So that brings us to kind of the end of the timeline as I have created it. There's a lot that has happened in informed consent since then. I mean, even in the last few years, we're seeing informed consent come up in different avenues, but it's definitely been prevalent in the media.
As of my initial recording of this timeline in 2020, there have been a couple of updates that I would like to mention. At the time of this update, it is November 2021. August 21st, 2020 would have been Henrietta Lacks's 100th birthday. And I just thought that was important to mention. It gives us an excellent kind of scope of the time that we're talking about from Henrietta Lacks's birth to now. And then most recently, in 2021, in the news again, attorney Ben Crump will represent the Lacks family and Henrietta Lacks estate in a lawsuit just filed October 4th of this year. The lawsuit seeks to hold Thermo Fisher Scientific, a company, accountable for unjust enrichment. The lawsuit alleges that the $30 billion biotech company is well aware that the HeLa cells for sale on its website were taken from Lacks without her consent. According to the lawsuit, Thermo Fisher Scientific makes at least 12 product lines using HeLa cells, and the cost of one vial of the ESRE blah HeLa cells line sells for just over $11,500, which is pretty outrageous. University of Baltimore Law School professor Max Oppenheimer, patent attorney, biotech expert, and specialist in intellectual property, agrees that the civil complaint paints a troubling picture, raising both moral and legal issues, but cautions that Crump and his legal team will have several challenges ahead during their lawsuit. So keep an eye on that in the coming months, and if there are any further updates, I will amend this timeline.